100% of the people that come to me to work on core values think they know what they are. And guess how many don't? 100%
I would say all of them.
Yes, all of them. Because we have been taught that everything is outside of us. Everything that's good is out here. It is a very Eastern thought to think that anything in here is good.
That's Andrea Johnson, aka the Queen of Core Values. Andrea helps business professionals show up authentically through their own unique core values. And that's what today's episode is all about. How to avoid mimicking others and live through your personal brand's core values so you attract your ideal client. On this episode, we'll learn what are personal core values and why are they important?
These are the principles and the priorities that guide your individual action.
Where do our core values come from and how do we discover them?
You're pretty much born with them. It's kind of how you're wired. It's the non-negotiables in your own personality.
And how we can use our core values to show up authentically and attract the right audience.
The gift is still you. The gift is still everything that you have to offer. It's figuring out how to wrap it for a specific audience. When you do that, they are excited to unwrap it.
So let's learn all about our personal brand core values together on this episode of Brand Science. I am super excited because, when I started this podcast about a month or a half ago now, I named it Brand Science because I wanted to take the more philosophical and psychological approach to personal branding and branding overall. And largely that is through the vessel of understanding who you are as a person, the personal and personal branding, so that you can show up as your most authentic self. And that's what today's conversation is all about: authenticity, understanding who you are at your core and what those values are, so that we can apply that to our personal brands, apply that to our content, and ultimately within our business to help us, grow our businesses, create quality content. And at the end of the day, just feel comfortable and confident in who we are. So largely when it comes to personal branding is you start with, okay, who are you and how did you get started in your business? What I want to know from you is, how did you kind of are the core values expert, right? So I want to know what is your story that led to you being this core values expert? What is the start for you that got you into all this?
Well, thanks for having me, Dave. I love having these conversations. I'm literally in the process of writing my next personal podcast episode on the difference between the core values and principles, and which we'll probably talk about. So it's like I'm finally to the place where I must be the core values lady because I'm already starting to do question and answer things on my podcast.
Sure.
So I feel like that's like when you can see how your own stuff takes off, it's exciting. But I began with core values over like almost 30 years ago. Are you familiar with Franklin Covey?
Yes.
Franklin Planner System?
Slightly.
Okay, so it's a really, it's like daytimer on steroids. It's like it had, at one point, my husband and I each had like big binders. His was huge. I had the mini and it was still like 3 inches thick. And it had like 3 rings and days and months and weeks. And you could get all these different types. You can still get them. If you're a person who needs a planner, you can get one. Well, I started in 1995 after Stephen Covey took over. I read his book and I walked through the process of figuring out my own, what he called governing values. Okay. So this was my start 30 years ago, 29 years ago. And you can tell my husband and I got married 29 years ago. So this is back when it started. But I still have it today. They're still valuable today. And it's still got my 6 holes in it and it's laminated with packing tape. Right. Necessity is the mother of invention. And my top core value at the time, or my top governing value, it's a little bit different, is freedom. And as a 27-year-old, because I don't shy away from my age, as a 27-year-old, freedom from everything sounded amazing. And I didn't really know why, but I just said, I don't have a job and I have money, freedom, and all that kind of stuff. Well, as we continue through life and as we grow, or as we kind of get bogged down, if you will, or get into the hamster wheel of, I went into working at universities and spent almost 25 years in higher education. I kind of lost touch. I kept this. All my Franklin planners are not here, but I kept this. But when I was 50, I lost my mom to breast cancer. And it was a long battle for her, but it was a wake-up call for me because at the time I had an 8-year-old adopted son and I was 50. And I knew that I did not, I'm hoping I have another 50, 50 years. I'm hoping that was the halfway point. We'll see if I'm healthy. But I knew that I didn't want to continue doing what I was doing. And I said, I have to find something different because I had evolved and grown into managing and operations in schools of medicine. So I did a research administration and administration. And at any given moment, I was managing up to 30 people.
Mm.
And the definition of managing is to continue the status quo. It's to make things run smoothly. I am not a status quo kind of person, Dave. I just am
Sure.
not.
Yeah.
And I would hire people as like an administrative assistant, and I would say, hey, this is not a landing pad for you. This is a launch pad for you. I don't want to see
Mm.
you here in 3 years. How can we make you? Because I'm all about making the whole university system better, right? I see big things like that. And so I would get in trouble when somebody would leave. The chief would say, well, what did you do wrong? I'm like, no, I did everything right. I did my job. They
Right.
got a bigger and better
Yeah.
job. And they're like,
Sign
no,
of
that
sign
means
of
we have to
success.
fill it again. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's just this whole mindset. And so I was like, I have to do something different. I have to do something where I can help others grow, help them lead, figure out ways that I can be myself. Cause I was constantly feeling like I had responsibility without authority. Um, I was always compromising who I felt like I needed to like show up as and to be
Mm.
authentic. That's a word that you use. And I was told that I needed to keep my mouth shut and I needed to not rock the boat. And you're not funny, Andrea. Don't do funny things in the finance meeting. I'm like, but that's the only way that we can get through the finance meeting. I
Sure.
mean, it's just, and I'm like, I am funny, and you just don't like my humor. I mean, it's just all those things.
Mm.
And so a friend of mine that I'd known since I was 17 said, Andrea, you need to take a look at the Maxwell leadership team.
Mm.
And this is John Maxwell, who's an international leadership guru. And I said, okay. So I took a look at it. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is an opportunity because I had tried to be an entrepreneur, right? We're talking about personal brands. I had tried to do it. I was looking for a way to be free, like I had said long ago.
Yeah.
And I had done at Amway, I had done Mary Kay. I'd realized it's a really good elimination process. I am not a product person. I'm not, especially if it's not my product. It's not mine. It's not authentic, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Every
Yeah.
time Mary Kay would change a formula, I'd be like, darn it, now I don't feel like I can be a Mary Kay lady.
Sure.
So I realized this was an opportunity for me it's to use a certification and a system where I could still be 100% me and show up and do the things that I wanted to do. And part of my coaching training was looking back at my core values. And it was the first time I had pulled them out in a long time. And I walked through an exercise and realized, oh my goodness, these are not really my core values. They really are governing values. They're almost like principles. And so the more I got into it, the more I realized that was the work that I really needed to do because I am a certified disc consultant, speaker, trainer, and coach. I do workshops. I do executive coaching. I have digital courses. I have a podcast, all kinds of things. But my heart's work is helping people instead of start from the outside and move in, because that's where we always start, right? We always start from the outside with a system. We talked before we jumped on here, really, you didn't want to come up with like a new way to manipulate the Instagram hashtag algorithm. You wanted to
Yeah.
give people a way to like be authentic and have good content rather than worrying about all those other little hacks and tricks.
Right.
And that's kind of where I landed is I didn't want to work with the outside stuff in. I wanted to start from the inside out with people. So that's
Right.
kind of how I got into core values.
That's it's so beautiful because, and then I see the correlation. That's a great correlation you just made here because, what you just said basically was you tried other people's products, and so you tried to kind of put on the mask of, I really love this product, you should buy it, blah blah blah, but maybe you didn't really fully believe in it, didn't align with your values and
Right.
such. And but you saw like other people are successful selling Amco or whatever it is, your
Hmm.
Cutco knives and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
So yeah, why not me?
exactly.
I'll put my mold into that, and then I'll be successful, right?
Hmm.
But then you found that, since that didn't align with who you were in your core, you went through, I guess it sounds like kind of a discovery phase just to understand,
Yeah.
okay, what are my core values? What does that core look like? And then now you are able to apply that to something that not just aligns with in a more authentic way, but also like you were able to now produce your own product and
Right.
service. So something even greater kind of came out of that. And then you just kind of correlated that at the beginning of this podcast. I mentioned that I didn't want to start this. I didn't want to create another podcast that was talking about like Instagram growth hacks and like what hashtags to use because it didn't feel authentic to me. I'm
Mhm.
more of like a philosophical, psychological kind of guy,
Mhm.
and so I wanted to vessel the podcast through this. So I feel like the conversations are so much more fluid because we can nerd out about similar topics. So I love that concept. You mentioned
Can I pop in with one more thing there?
absolutely, yeah.
Um, so even when like I was certified in 2019 for so 5 years ago with Maxwell. And at the very beginning I had already come up with my own what I call personal growth lifestyle of intentional optimism that has 6 tenets, and it's how we behave, it's how we live out all of our stuff. And I really wanted to do my own thing, but I knew that I needed a vehicle, and so I thought, well, I'll do this. But at the first 2 years, I really struggled because I felt like I'm trying to sell Maxwell stuff. I'm trying to do Maxwell things. And I had to grow and learn myself good enough to understand that I can show up and teach a Maxwell book in a mastermind or coach in an Andrea way that allowed me to now say, I got a free mastermind coming up. Do you want to participate? Because they're going to get it different from me than they're going to get from my mentor. Very different because of who I am, because of my spunky, welcoming, wise personality. And she's like a colonel in the Air Force,
Mhm.
so it's very different. And so I think it's good to see too that it's not just that we don't want to do something that's somebody else's product. Sometimes it's really good to do that, but there are many ways to do that one thing. And even if you and I had the exact same goal and we're both John Maxwell people, you show up differently than I do. And that's the part that I want us to celebrate. That's where personal branding comes from.
Absolutely. That's a direct correlation right there. And what we always say is, yeah, we work a lot with realtors, right?
Mhm.
So there's thousands and thousands of realtors, in the United States, let's say.
It's shocking.
And why you over someone else, right?
Mhm.
Why you over the realtor next door? And to your point, it's not always the what, but it's the how. Like,
Mhm.
what is your unique approach? What is your maybe I vibe with you a little bit more. Maybe the way you would approach, buying or selling the house is something a little bit more aligned with me. And part of that, one is you need to feel comfortable actually presenting those things so that people can see it, right? Being public with that through your content and, just being confident enough to present yourself in a kind of vulnerable way so that people can understand that.
Right.
But two is sounds like there's a lot of kind of work that needs to be done to ensure because we want to avoid copying other people, right?
Mhm.
Because then that leads to catastrophe, which we'll talk about. But um, well, I guess let's start there, right? So I know you've mentioned largely. Well, actually, you had a note that said my clients struggle with feeling disempowered, so I improve coaching and training that help them move from imitating other people's principles and priorities to defining their own sustainable, impactful leadership. Why do you think when people maybe get into a new role or want to start a new business or start to show up with their personal brands online, why do you think they default to imitating someone else versus naturally showing up authentically?
Well, that's the natural way that we learn.
Hmm.
Every child. Do you have kids?
I do not. None
Okay.
that I know about, as I like to say.
Do you have any children in your life? If
I
you
have a
have
niece,
kids, I mean,
niece and
if you have
nephews.
nieces and nephews, you've watched them. They mimic your words. They mimic what you do. I love my son. He's 15 now, but when we adopted him, I was 42, and my husband stayed home with him. I actually worked, but he would all of a sudden he would come out with something, and I'd look at him and say, "How are you not genetically related to my husband?" Because it was just like Steve. I mean, just like him. That's how we learn. That's the very first way we learn. I'm working in Duolingo right now, learning. I grew up in Korea, but I want to learn Korean better. So I'm like working in that every day. And there's a mimicking that comes from that. The problem is when you move as you move through school, you move from learning to how to mimic things to how to think on your own and how to apply the principles of what you have to your own learning and your own life. That's just our natural way of learning. The problem is when we're adults, if we start off mimicking, a lot of times we may not have the tools or we may not remember what it's like to then take those principles and apply them to our own work and our own life and our own message. And I'm not
Mm.
immune to that. I have the same problem because I am, I'm 57. I get kind of entrenched in. And so I am very aware whenever I'm trying to like be like someone else. And it's also safer to be like someone else because we're not bearing our own soul, so to speak. And so I think those things coupled together make us just kind of ripe for that type of thing. And we don't need to beat ourselves up over it. We need to understand that it's a normal process and it's okay to start someplace like that. But then we have to like try out our own things in order to be able to like get the wet wings dry. It's like,
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's so true. I mean, I went through this completely myself, and this is, yeah, coming into content creation, you want to show up in the best light, and sometimes you're like, all right, well, I'll just borrow someone else's light and try to do what they're doing, so that if they're successful, then it means if I do it, I'll be successful potentially. But I think to your point, you mentioned like eventually you figure out what it means for you to do it in your own way. I feel like there's a certain point, a boiling point where
yeah,
you get to a point where it feels so icky to
yeah,
do it this way
yeah,
anymore. You finally shed that skin, and you're like, okay, I it's too tiresome to do it this way anymore.
sure.
I need to do it authentically. And you know what? If people don't like it, who cares? At least I'm like, it's more. I can't spend any more energy trying to pretend to be someone else. Is
Yeah.
that kind of how you see it?
Yeah. Well, that and my son grows out of shoes way faster than I can replace them, and it gets painful, right? And if we're not growing to grow
Mm,
out of the quote unquote shoes that we're in, then it becomes painful and we get bogged down or we limit ourselves to stay inside the little box we've put ourselves in. And that's the piece that I love to work on with people. If they feel stifled, it's probably not because anybody's got their thumb on them. I mean, if that's a situation, we'll get you out of your job and find you a new one. Most of the time, it's us. Like I have a client that I'm working with right now in my one-on-one coaching on core values. And she just looked at me and she said, I am the worst perpetrator. I said, yes, you are the worst perpetrator when it comes to dishonoring your core values.
mm.
We do that to ourselves because we want to be accepted, because we want to succeed, because the long game is really long, because I mean, all of those things, it's normal behavior. But the more we understand about ourselves and that working hard doesn't necessarily get us where we want to go, we have to work a little smarter, which this is terrible. It's like, a quip, but we need to understand why we're working, and our core values help us understand that. And getting all the certifications or all the courses doesn't necessarily get us any further down the road if we can't apply it. So we need to look at, do I really want a resume or do I want results? And
Right.
all of these things come into play when you're starting to look at have understanding your core values, because we can have a growth mindset for 50 years and never get anywhere, right? Because we're
Right.
just input, 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 and we're not reflecting or taking action on what we have. And so when you are willing to take a look inside, then you can actually see, "Ah, well, that's why being in a meeting with that person bothers me, or that's why doing a reel in this way is so difficult for me. If I'm standing in, and trying to walk around and be all perfect, then I might have to do 3 or 4 takes on a video. But
Mm.
I finish my workout on my exercise bike and I look in the camera and I'd say, did you do your thing today? I mean, it's like it's so many views. I mean, none of mine get huge, but it's like bigger views, or a reel that has something like that. It's natural, it's normal, it's me. And people are like, that one I get because it's my energy that comes through. Right.
Right. And that's to your point about, creating content that is inauthentic to you, and maybe you're not seeing much success with it, but that moment, yeah, you start living through kind of what's authentically you, your core beliefs and values, and that one takes off. You feel so much more. Let's say you did have one that really took off, but you kind of just mimicked someone else's content, and that's why it did well, versus something that was authentically you, that you published and did really well. Which one are you going to feel more
Mm.
excited about and feel more accomplished about. Well, the one
Mhm.
that was truly you, people are kind of like cheering on the real version of you. So what I want for our audience today is to understand, okay, we want that for you. We want you to show up in your most authentic self and create your most authentic content that is aligned with your core values. I think the big question everyone has then is like, how? Like, how do I know what it means to be authentic? How do I find what my core values are so that I can start applying it? Because, like we talked about, there's kind of that hero's journey kind of need to you
Sure.
find what the thing is that kind of defines you. So what would you say to someone who wants to show up more authentically, and what are kind of like the first steps they can take to start understanding what those kind of core values are, that they can start living through?
Well, I like to start with a definition. I'm a word girl. I love them. I like words. Even in my podcast episodes, people know they're just going to get a definition from me. And the
Sure.
way I define core values is very specific because there's a lot of talk out there about core values in businesses and organizations. And so I want to make sure that we are on the same page as what we're talking about. If you want to define them differently and do them differently in your life, that is completely your prerogative. But when I'm talking about them, this is what I mean. These are the principles and the priorities that guide your individual actions, right? They're like your internal compass. They represent the foundational convictions that allow you to navigate the complex twists and turns and waves and winds of life while keeping your identity and your authority at the forefront. And we talk authenticity a lot of times, but what we really mean is authority. We mean to have authority over my own thoughts, ideas, body, whatever, job, career, business. It's the having that authority. So when I talk about core values, they are inside, they are not outside. And I always start a workshop by telling people, I'm so glad you're here. 100% of the people that come to me to work on core values think they know what they are. And guess how many don't? A
I would say
hundred
all of
percent of
them.
them. Yes,
Yeah.
all of them. Because we have been taught we're Westerners, right? We're taught that everything is outside of us. Everything that's good is out here. It is a very Eastern thought to think that anything in here is good. It's just the way we're
Mm.
wired, and it's the way we think, and the way that's kind of the water we swim in. So I tell them, if you tell me that faith, family, country, or something, friends or whatever are your core values, I'm going to push back and we're going to start over. Because my job here is to make sure that you figure out yours, not what's outside of you. So when I talk about stop imitating other people's principles and priorities, that's what I'm talking about. Don't take on anybody else's for you. So to start with, we look at a definition, and then we look at what they are and what they aren't. And so again, they're not your beliefs. Beliefs are changeable. Okay. So a lot of people say, well, I believe this is my core belief. I'm like, that's great. But I'll bet if something came along that proved to you that that belief was something else than you thought it was, you'd change it. So they're not beliefs. They are also not, they're not outside you. They're not beliefs. They are things that are invisible yet very tangible when they're violated. Okay.
Mm.
So, for instance, I have quite a few clients whose core value, top one, is respect. And when it's really important, and that could show up in don't lie to me. It could show up in treat me in a different way. It could show up in all kinds of ways of being dishonored, is what I like to say. Because if we align with something, then we're taking on something outside of ourselves. So I like to say honored in more of a boundary type way. But respect is not just good if it's for me, because that's almost narcissism, right? It's like, you have to respect me, right? If you just don't respect me, then we have a problem. But if
Mm.
I don't want respect for you, that's not a core value for me. That's some kind of an ego play. That's some kind of an inconsistency, or maybe an immaturity, right? So core values are what I call reciprocal. My top core value, I realize, is not just freedom. It's autonomy of thought, a freedom of thought.
Mm.
And so I want I want to be able to think critically, but I want you to think critically, right? And if I want that for you more than I want it for me, then that means that I don't want you to think like I think. And I was not raised that way. So that's
Yeah.
that has been a cognitive dissonance for me, and it still is to this day. I really do want you to think like me, but my core says, "No, no, let them think for themselves." So
Yeah, I
those
feel
are
like that's
the
part of, like, our natural inkling to want acceptance is,
yes. Yeah.
we need to, be aligned so that I feel like we're in the same tribe here or something, right?
Right. So it's like putting out little feelers and figuring out where you plug in. That's not that's not honoring your core values.
Mm,
That's aligning with what's out there, and that's imitating other people's principles and priorities.
right.
And that it so this is like a big mental shift for people to be able to say, "Oh, okay. So it's actually valid for me to say I want to think for myself." Or I had one who said her top core value, and we went round and round about this, but it's dependability. And because I'm like, of course, in my brain, I'm like, who wants to be dependable? That's boring. But for her, it mattered so much that it affected her relationships with her colleagues because if they would say they were going to do something and didn't, so it plays out in different ways. Your core values do not necessarily fit a Webster's dictionary definition. So for a lot of people, we'll start with a brain dump. This is how we actually do it. We start with a brain dump, figure out what we think other people say about us or how we live it out. And then we look at them and we say, well, what's important and what's real? And I have quite a few steps I go through. I've got a free download that you can use, and I've got a course and I've got coaching. So there's
We'll link
literally
it
all
in the
kinds of
description.
ways. Yeah. But it starts with a brain dump, then we narrow it down. And then a lot of times what we'll have is like 10 or 12. And when you really look at them, Dave, it's like these three define this one, and these three define this one, and these three define this one. And they're all like a little subset. And so a lot of times I'll even, depending on if this person is visually oriented, I might have them like draw a diagram or a picture of how those core values show up, like a Venn diagram or stair steps or, arrows like in a subset. I mean, depending on how they think, so that they can see how that works. And then you get to write your own definition, which then becomes almost a living principle. Like, this is how I live my life. Once you've got them, then your boundaries become pretty clear and pretty easy to enforce, which means that you're not defensive anymore, which means that you get to walk into situations and know exactly where I end and you begin. It means that I'm not going to put anything out on my social media that does not align with that needs to align with me. I don't need to align with
Mhm.
it, right? So
Yeah.
so for me, it's I want to honor everything in my core values, and that's kind of that's how I work with people. I could probably go on, but I sense you might have a question.
No, well, yeah, I do actually. So, the one area you mentioned, someone had, I guess, dependability as their top core value, and you kind of made it a note that maybe that was because of a relationship they had or something to that effect. Is there where do our core values come from? Is
Mm,
that based in is that nature, nurture, how we were brought up, the experiences we've had in our life? Like, what shapes those core? I know we can define them or we can discover them, if you will,
mhm.
but what is it about our past that has helped shape those?
I think that I think that we're born with them, honestly. I believe that. And like if you look at other people who really famous people who do core value work, like Brene Brown, and that's pretty much where they come from, is that you're pretty much born with them. It's kind of how you're wired. It's the non-negotiables in your own personality. The difference between how I would define it is they shape us in a way depending on our circumstances. So if we have an environment that nurtures a core value of independence, then you've got a really independent person, and they may be able to live in a way that honors that all their lives. But if you've got an independence wiring in your core value and you've got a nurturing environment that's very controlling, then you're either going to dishonor that and always be conflicted, or you're going to be in conflict with your environment all the time, which
Right.
then shapes everything else about us. Right. So I think every conversation, every argument, every joy, every tear, every beautiful relationship or hard relationship, every job has somehow touched a core value. And you've either said this is okay or this is not. I really think it comes down to something that binary.
Sure. Which is interesting too, because you know, people who maybe felt like the black sheep in their environment,
Me.
Yeah, there you go. Like,
Yeah.
you know, you probably your environment was in conflict with a core value, but if you never really do the work to understand that, you probably just feel like maybe you're wrongfully an outcast, but maybe it's just you were just not in the right environment, the wrong shape in
Oh, yeah.
in
Square peg,
yeah,
round hole kind of thing. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I guess beyond taking that to the throughout your life, doing the work early is, I assume, as beneficial as it gets because you can decide on what college you want to go to, what career you want to get into. Is that what tip? When do you typically see people want realize? Sounds like this should really be done as early as possible. When do you see people typically come to you with a desire to do this work? What has kind of happened in their lives where they go, okay, I need to finally take care of this?
Honestly, I see it with like millennials and older.
Oh,
Partially because, we're not taught critical thinking anymore. And so, like my youngest client, who I haven't actually finished coaching with, is just graduating from college.
mm,
And that was because a family member said, "Oh my gosh, this is amazing." And so it's like, but I'm not entirely sure that this client feels the urgency or the need to do it. And there's nothing really wrong with that. But I think the older we get, the more we see the conflict, the more we've dealt with the conflict in ourselves, the more frustrated we've become, either in our careers or lack thereof, the more we've seen relationships broken and or repaired based on some of these things. And the maturity that we have when we hit 35, 40 is the kind of thing that spurs us into asking for help or looking for help. Right now, most of my clients are in their late 30s.
mm. Yeah, that's interesting too because they've made it 30 plus years really not knowing themselves, and then yeah, especially if you are starting a personal brand, the critical first step is kind of self awareness. So again, going back to the idea that you're stepping into a new environment and you're looking around and seeing who's successful, and you might feel like the black sheep where you're like going back to like your humor, right? Like, I
Hmm.
want to express myself in a comedic way,
Hmm.
but if I feel like maybe what's not popular right now is not that my type of humor, am I going to fit in online or whatever? um but yeah, there's a the keynote there is there's a lid for every pot out there,
Oh,
trust me. There's
absolutely.
Yeah.
And John Maxwell actually has this law. He calls the law of the lid. It's like you just can't go any farther. You can't go up any higher than your character or your self-awareness or anything. It's going to cap you off.
Mm,
And one of the things that I would like to just share as I don't know, a hopeful piece maybe, is that a lot of like these clients that I have, they're in their late 30s, they have successful businesses. They have successful brands. What they've got is a lid. They just can't get any higher, or they're frustrated, or they feel like, I'm not sure this is what I want to do. And that's why they came to me. And so, what I help them see is they have been imitating other people's principles or priorities. A lot of times we follow the rules of the business. A lot of times we follow what everybody else in front of us has said to do, which is fine. That's what I stated at the very beginning. It's like, this is how we learn. And now we have to look at how we can actually show up as ourselves and be more authentic, which is going to give you that level up to the next step. So it's not that people are not self aware until then. It's just they've started from the outside in, and now it's time. There will come a reckoning. And you will hit this place where, unless you have this amazing dynamic personality, if you're not honoring who you are at your core, it's going to come full circle.
sure. So we talked about kind of how to identify core values. How can we apply that? So once we fully understand what those core values are, when and where are we applying that in order to, in many cases, grow our business, create
Mhm.
relationships, but also, maybe we can correlate this within the personal branding space of like content creation or just showing up, public speaking, and things like that, where
Mhm.
we can apply those core values.
Yeah, I work with my clients to apply them absolutely everywhere. Now, does that mean you walk out and say, "Here's my list. These are my core values. Y'all
Right.
need to honor them"?
Yeah.
Please don't. people are going to think you're nuts
Yeah. Unless that's a core
because
value is
they're not.
communication.
Yeah. It's like my core values are not your core values.
Right.
My core values need to be honored. They're not, I mean, it's not that we can't celebrate them, but they're not necessarily something that needs to be out here. We don't wear them as a banner unless it's like, I just got to be me. I mean, there's something like, there's something to that. So when I work with the last piece of, if you do a course or coaching with me, the last piece is integration. And I kind of look at a life wheel and say, where in your life do you feel like you have the most conflict? That's where we're going to start. We're going to integrate them first there. And the way we integrate is we start off easy with, like I use little notebooks, put one at the top of the page, turn the page, put another one at the top of the page, and just start writing down or give yourself 5 or 6 pages and just start paying attention to where that core value is being honored or where it's being dishonored. Because when we can see that it's always dishonored in my family, okay, then maybe I need to like be a little bit more, I need to put a little more scaffolding in there. Or when I go to do my social media or when I show up, like I've had to redo my brand on my website a couple of times because at the time I had this level of awareness that I thought it needed to be this. And then it was this. And then it was like, now it's very simple, but there's lots of room for me to be the color. Like if you look at my website, it's white with some dark, I don't know, it's kind of a gray brown. And then all the color is me, very vibrant photos. I had to work with a photographer to say, don't put a filter on those. I need that May sunshine
Yeah.
to come through. And she's right. Oh my gosh, you're totally right. Because I decided I have to be the color in my brand. So I have lots of succulents and I'm kind of like flamingos and pineapples, but they're not as prominent as they used to be because it's no longer that, it's me. So I want to integrate me in a way that helps people understand this is what you're going to get when you work with me, which is, I think, the whole point.
Yeah.
But when you start putting them in and saying, how can I honor this? Use it as a filter, right? Like if something's coming in that I think I need to do, I'll filter it through my core values. Does this honor these core values? Well, if it doesn't honor at least one of them, we got to talk about it, right? Or use it as a guardrail. My son loved bowling when he was younger. So we would put those bumper guards or the gutter guards in, and that made sure that it wouldn't go in the gutter and we could, stay in the lane, right? It's like, it helps you stay in your lane.
Mhm. And so you mentioned almost kind of a visual representation of your core values in a
Mhm.
way, talking about, when it comes to like imagery or even just your setup when you're, doing these kind of video podcasts and what you want to represent visually. Is, is there a practice for kind of translating core values into like IRL in terms of maybe it's the clothing you wear, maybe it's the
Yeah.
how you represent yourself visually, maybe how you speak and things. 'Cause we talked about how we imitate others early on because it's safe, and then we start to kind of deconstruct who we are at our core so that we can represent that and start peeling
Mhm.
away some of the elements that we've been mimicking this entire time. Is there a way? Is there a practice for how to translate those core values into the more visual and sometimes like auditory versions of ourselves?
Visual representations, I think, can be very helpful. They sometimes, like a Venn diagram will show how the things overlap, and then you've got like, if you have one that really stands out but you've got 3 or 4 that seem to kind of feed that, then a Venn diagram where they all overlap in the middle with that one is probably a really good representation for you. But then when you actually go to live it out in your life, you'll notice I'm wearing yellow, right? I don't do, I mean, I might do pale pink, but other than that, I do like really bright colors because I happen to be a little bit loud and I happen to be a little bit vivacious, and I just need to be that person. I talked about how that shows up on my website. The color is mine. Even though I'm in a white blouse, the color is me. When you're looking at how you walk or talk or even the makeup a woman might wear or not wear, right? All of those things are representations of who you are. And when you start looking at how you're authentic, my second core value is being authentic. And that's just like saying all those things that everybody said I shouldn't be. That's who I am. I mean, I was literally told, not everybody wants to hear your opinion, Andrea. And now people are like thrilled to get my opinion.
They pay you
Like,
for your opinion.
they pay me for my opinion. And my third is belonging. So therefore, when I said spunky, welcoming, and wise, it's like I want to make sure that, Dave, you feel like you belong in this conversation as much as I do, and that anybody listening feels like they belong in this conversation. Therefore, my coach friend loves sweary Andrea, which doesn't come out that often,
Mm,
but I don't do that as often because my core value is I want you to feel like you belong. And if you sat here and swore at me all day long, then maybe I'd swear back. But most of the time, I'm going to pepper my speech with things that are going to be more uplifting just because that's my core value. And I want you to feel that from me.
sure. Well, I want to touch on that for a second because your second core value is authenticity. Your third core value is belonging. And it almost feels like, to a degree, one can contradict the other in the sense that, like, you want to show up authentically, but you also want to make sure the other person's comfortable. So you'll somewhat turn off some settings in order to make sure the other person feels like they can be authentic to you. But at the same time, I still, to maybe what you're saying is that's still authentic.
Mhm.
You're not showing up as something wrong or incorrect or mimicking something else. You just have the other person's intention in mind. And the reason I say this is because I feel I do the same thing too, a little bit of a chameleon in the sense of, like, let me understand what your vibe is. And then I want us to be comfortable in this conversation. So I'll tweak some settings to ensure we're on the same wavelength here. But then I always have this conflict of, like, okay, well, is that being inauthentic? Is that wrong? So is that, am I wrong for then thinking that?
Oh, you're so wrong. No.
Yeah, right.
Um, no self-flagellation. We don't do that here.
Sure, sure, sure.
Um, the word I would use for it is maturity. Now,
Mm,
as a 57-year-old woman with bright gray hair and white hair, I can say that word and it doesn't usually offend people that much. But we don't use it that often today. But I think it's a really helpful thing to see, where have I grown? Like, I don't have to be full out authentic in order to get my point across, right? I don't have to be that anymore. There was a time when I was really angry about some stuff, and I had to get really quiet on social media because that's not, I knew I was angry in the moment, but I knew that's not who I really am, that I'm not naturally a really angry person, but I can get spicy.
mm,
But I had to tone it down in order to make sure that I didn't do damage to either my brand, but it wasn't even that. It was really more like I just needed to walk through that on my own. I needed to kind of do it on my own. So when you talk about being a chameleon, there's a certain amount of that, and only you are going to know, quite frankly, whether or not you're doing that in an unhealthy way or a healthy way.
mm,
None of my top three core values are going to completely outshine the other. They're going to complement. So for me, it's almost like a stair step or like a circle with like the arrows that keep pointing around and around. So if I'm going to visually represent it, because my freedom of thought is such that I'm not going to take on what you believe without really putting it through a couple of filters. I'm just not. I'm way past that. I did it for a long time, and then I went through lots of deconstruction, and I'm done. I mean, I'm continuing to do it, but I'm done, like, just taking things hook, line, and sinker.
yeah.
Um, but being authentic that's part of being authentic is critical thinking. Part of being authentic is wanting to belong, but recognizing that if I don't get that from you, I don't have to come back.
Mm,
Right. I mean, it's like it's not like we have to show up with our core values as battling rams or anything that's going to like make other people conform. It just makes it really easy to figure out who your people are and who they aren't. And that's something that
yeah.
we talk about in marketing all the time.
Mm,
And so if I drop a sweary word in a podcast or somewhere and it really offends somebody, then they probably weren't my people because I don't do it very often, but I do it when it's really intense. And I mean, that's a very minor kind of example, but
yeah.
yeah, being a chameleon is meeting the other person where they are. And so that, I think, is also a sign of maturity.
Sure. Well, I appreciate you calling me mature, first of all.
Sure, man.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to what we talked about, where there's some element to that where it sounds like, okay, maybe time and place, you want to present your persona in such a way that helps the situation or the person you're speaking to, but maybe in a more public setting where you are trying to filter out the masses and attract your ideal client, your ideal audience, would you say you maybe want to put put the pedal down a little bit more, lean on the scale a little bit more on the things that are really true to you? So if I would say, what are the things that are going to allow your ideal audience to truly understand who you are and be attracted to that version of yourself? I would assume you wouldn't want to hide those things too much. Maybe on a one-to-one basis,
Right.
you're meeting them halfway, but when you're online, you're not speaking one-to-one, you're speaking one-to-many. So
Mhm.
would you say you maybe not want to do it at that point, but instead maybe highlight those things? Like if you curse and you know that your person, your ideal client is someone who's going to vibe with that, because if you're in the service businesses, you're gonna be working with them directly one on one. So if that's just who you are, you want them to vibe with that concept. So would you say you want to kind of highlight those some things
Yeah.
when you're speaking more to the public setting?
Yeah, and for me, the way that shows up is my belonging piece comes out a lot. When I am talking to people, it's been a while since I've done a reel because I'm doing a lot of this. I've been doing a lot of podcast interviews because I know I do better in a conversation. And so I use some of that as like my social media because I know myself and I know that I can have a
Yeah.
much more authentic conversation and that belonging will show up because the people who want to talk to me or need to do the work with me need to feel like it's okay to be themselves. So I really highlight that belonging core value in the way that I speak. I used to call myself a professional encourager, and that's not quite the word I want to use anymore for various and sundry reasons, because it's not all sunshine and butterflies. Because sometimes the professional encourager has to actually say to you, "Hey, you got to stop that," or "This is hurting you," or "You're not being true to yourself." But I also want them to just feel that continued and an immediate welcome, and that when people talk to me about my podcast, they're like, "Your voice is so welcoming." I'm like, "Really?" I mean, that's not something I would have thought. I think my voice sounds like a little girl, but when I lean into that belonging piece, that's what clients for me come to me and say, "You're a safe place for me. I can talk about these things with
Mm,
you." And that's something I learned when I was in my corporate work is people would come to my office all the way up to the chair of the department just to talk to me
mm,
because I could shut the door and it was a safe place and they knew it was going to be a safe place. So that doesn't supersede my need to think critically. If somebody comes to me and says something about that I just don't agree with, I've gotten to the place where now in an interpersonal relationship, I'll say, you know, I don't actually believe that anymore, or I don't agree with you, or, and that's okay. They might have a problem, but I don't anymore. That's where that one shows up. And then the authenticity piece is just being real, playing into that belonging, especially for my public and my clients, and then playing into that freedom of thought in all of my personal life. That's where those things show up. And so I think you need to look at what yours are, what is the main thing that is so attractive to your clients, because especially if you're doing any kind of service, there's something about you that is attractive to your clients. That's the piece that you want to look at. Well, is that a core value? And if so, how can I really highlight that?
absolutely. And you mentioned earlier on the podcast something about the disc styles. Was that correct?
Mm,
I've never heard
yes.
of that. What can you walk us through that?
Oh, sure. Okay. That's a whole other podcast, but we'll
Sure.
just do a real quick
Part two coming soon.
encapsulated version. We're
Yeah.
going to do a capsule wardrobe on the disc.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, so DISC is a behavioral analysis tool that I'm certified in, and lots of people are. People Keys puts it out. It's based on really old ideas, like all the way back to Hippocrates, of the four humors. Like, if you've seen the red, yellow, green, and blue personality types, this is basically the DISC, and it's based on the continuum of an X and Y axis, where the Y axis is a continuum between outgoing and reserved, and the X axis is a continuum of people versus task or process. So when you take this assessment, you're going to plot out somewhere on this graph. My son's finishing his geometry this week. So I'm like all in the graph phase.
Yeah.
But when you look at the four quadrants, we have a little bit of all of them, but it's basically where you fall on the continuum of those. So the reason it's called DISC is because it's an acronym. It stands for D. D is the dominance. This is your top left quadrant. These are your outgoing, process, or task driven people. They're only about 3% of the population, and they drive the bus. I promise. You do not want a bunch of bus drivers. It's good that we only have 3%.
Yeah.
But these are very results oriented, bottom line kind of people. You know these people, I promise. They will stand out in your life, and they're usually pretty powerful personalities.
Mm.
The top right quadrant is also outgoing, but they're people oriented. These are your eyes, your influencers, and your inspirationals. People like me who like to wear yellow or have a sense of humor, love to tell stories. Half the questions you asked me, I answered with a story. That's just natural for me. We're the life of the party. We come in and say, you can start now. And we're the ones that are going to be singing the songs on the bus and making everybody happy, right? About 11% of the population. The bottom right quadrant is the S. This is the steadies. These are, we're going red, yellow, green, right? These are the people that make the bus run on time, make sure everybody follows the rules on the bus. This is why you have teams. These are 69% of our population. When you look at a change curve, you're familiar with a change curve?
Hmm.
Okay. So if you're not familiar, those listening, it's a like a bell curve, and you have your early adopters, which are your D's and your I's. They're going to do change for change sake. Ooh, that sounds fun. And then you've got all the way on the other side at the very end is the mass of people that comes to the change after everybody's already done the work. These are your S's. They don't like change. You need to make them feel very safe and very secure before you do anything. The last quadrant is, and that's like I said, 69%. The last quadrant, the blue ones, are the C's. These are both your reserved and task oriented, because your S is reserved people, but the C's are your reserved task oriented. These are your compliance or creatives. They're good with numbers. They're good with details. They want to know every single detail of the project before they start. So if somebody's asking you all the questions, they're not interrogating you. They just want to know how they can get it right for you. So if a D who is very bottom line says, let's get this project out the door, and he talks to two C's about it, the C's are going to be like, but we have 5,000 more questions. And the D is just like, just get it done.
Hmm.
So understanding these patterns makes it much more likely that you can use that information to bridge the communication gap between you and your listener. So if, for instance, you work with a lot of accountants, if you're somebody who's putting, I have several CPAs that I follow, and they're really good about, they're probably C's. So they're really good about doing things that bring in all the other types. Talk about security and making sure you're financially secure speaks to the S's. Making things easy and fun, and you can have your kids work for you, speaks to the I's. And then making sure that you have all the details and your taxes are going to get filed really fast speaks to the D's, right? So, but at the same time, if I'm speaking to a lot of accountants, I want to make sure they have all the details, right? I want to make sure they have what they need. In any given audience, you're going to have any one of those. And if you know what the types are, you can pepper what you do in your marketing or your social media, or especially from the stage. Like if you're doing any kind of speaking, you need to do something that's going to be too long didn't read for the D's, and here's all the details for the C's, and everybody in between. You got to tell a couple of stories for your eyes. So that's why, like, I worked with a speaking coach for a year and a half, and all of those things were in there. And I even taught a disc seminar inside her membership because she's like, this is really important stuff. So when you understand speaking a different, like I grew up in Korea with kids from 65 different countries in my school.
Wow.
So I heard a lot of languages, and then I had Korean that I lived there. If you don't understand the language that someone else speaks and they don't speak your language, you automatically have a failure to communicate, right?
Hmm.
So understanding someone else's language, it's helps people feel seen, it helps people feel heard, and it makes sure that you're connecting with them on their level, not yours.
I love everything about that too, because as you were mentioning, correlating that to marketing, I think a lot of times when we do create our content, we forget. I think we most of the time default to creating content that most aligns with maybe where we are on that quadrant,
Mhm.
right? If we're very
Yes.
kind of detail oriented, I kind of resonated a little bit or mostly with the C, it sounded like,
Uh-huh.
kind of a
Yeah.
creative, like detail oriented one.
I
Um,
see your guitar in the background.
what's that?
I see your guitar in the background.
Yeah, yeah, see, there you go.
Mhm.
I can only play Wonderwall on it, so let's not. I don't want to. I don't wanna give the illusion that
Just
I'm
for show.
Jimi Hendrix
How
over here. No,
inauthentic.
that's for another podcast. I'll break some out. I'll do the intro music maybe for the next podcast. Um, so but yeah,
See, I make us laugh.
so so
I make us laugh.
but yeah, I think we default. to presenting, because it's like how we learned it and how we prefer to learn it is how we interpret it. So then that's how we present it.
Mhm.
But keeping in mind that they're not everyone thinks that way, and it's something I've had to go through as well, is
Yeah.
the idea that maybe people, um, resonate with hyperbole a little bit more than maybe the intricate details of something, right? Just kind of give me the
Mhm.
the 30,000 foot sexy take on the thing, and I'll subscribe to that. Versus other people, it sounds like are maybe a bit more of like, no, 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 show me like step by step how A
Yeah.
equals B.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, understanding that you have to present content in different ways. And so I love this idea of like the how-to content, the step-by-step content is very important for those types of people. And then those who are a little bit more like hyperbolic visual people, still can give that kind of excite content. But yeah, so I think going back to kind of being a chameleon and meeting people halfway,
Mhm.
um, knowing yourself and being true to yourself and how you present something, but also keeping in mind that you still have to meet your audience halfway with how they want to receive it. It sounds like is largely what the
Yeah.
value is there.
It's like figuring out how to wrap the gift.
Mm,
I mean, it's the gift is still you. The gift is still everything that you have to offer. It's figuring out how to wrap it for a specific audience. And when you do that, they are excited to unwrap it. And, my son is all about we got to have all the tape and it's like he's ripping the paper off, But I have a friend, it's like, it's, why is it not in a bag? I could just open it and just reach out and get the bag,
mm,
And I want all the pretty bows and make it fun. And if there's poppers and confetti, it's even
yeah.
better. So I think a lot of it, Dave, is just figuring out if you don't know what the gift is, that's where you have to start. And then figure out how to present the gift to other people.
Mm,
And remembering that the gift is not um, the, the gift is not for me. I am the gift. So the gift is for you. So I need to package it in a way that makes sense to you. And if we're not willing to do that, I don't think there's any compromise involved there. If what you're doing is going to compromise or dishonor your core values, then please find another way to do it. You have to find a way to present the gift in its best light. We know that when we see a little blue box with a white bow on it, it's from Tiffany's.
mm.
And they've figured out the perfect way to make sure that we know that it's valuable, whatever's in there, but we don't all need a box from Tiffany's. So I think that's really how I'd like to present it. And there's many ways to figure that out.
Sure. Well, I wanna wrap it up here. Speaking of gifts, the gift of this podcast, we'll wrap it up here, because I think that was just a perfect kind of summation in terms of what we talked about today. Because ideally, you want to understand what you want to provide to your audience, and that's understanding like who you are, and again, what product or offer you want to provide. But largely part of that is the how, in which is very reflective and understanding your core values, understanding, you know, who you are as a person so that you can represent that visually. And then, yeah, the packaging of that, keeping in mind who you're speaking to, and and making sure that you're also presenting it not just authentically, but in a way that your audience wants to consume. And it sounds like that's kind of the cultivation of everything we talked about. So that this was awesome. I knew this was going to be a fun, kind of philosophical and self-reflective conversation. So
Good.
this is really great. So before we sign off, I want to make sure. So people who are struggling to really show up authentically, people who are maybe feeling stifled in their careers and want
Mhm.
to, again, you mentioned some people are maybe seeing success, but they still feel like there's that lid. How can they find you? How can they find your resources to take the next?
Sure. My business is The Intentional Optimist. You can find me at theintentionaloptimist.com. If you go to LinkedIn or Instagram, I'm under that same moniker, The Intentional Optimist. If you DM me there and tell me that you heard me on Dave's podcast, I will know that you're not spam and I will respond. And because it's amazing how much DM junk we get, isn't it? Especially on
Sure.
LinkedIn right now.
Oh my
But
God.
the other thing is, if you want to get started in your core values, if you do feel like you're kind of stifled or disempowered or just kind of are curious, you can start with a one-page download that I have. If you go to my website, there's a button right above my head and it says free core values exercise. It's a downloadable one pager. At the bottom of that, it will tell you where to find my core values course, which is just a simple 4 6 module course, but I also do coaching along with that, and you can contact me for those things. If you're interested in the disc, all of my stuff, all of these things are available on my website. You can just, they're just click through purchases. You can do a disc assessment. It's a 30-page report, and the last 10 pages will give you a personal growth plan option. Like, this is how you can actually do it. So it may be that just the assessment's enough for you, but if not, I can do a 90-minute debrief with that, or I can come in and I can actually do work in your business, even if you have a small team, either virtually or in person. And I also offer coaching with those things too. So there's a lot of ways to work with me. Reach out and let me know you heard me here. I'm happy to help.
I love it. Well, I'll put some links in the description as well. But this has been awesome. I appreciate you spending some time with me today, and telling our audience how to find your core values and show up authentically, and yeah, grow your personal brand today. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.